Everything at the beginning, and we have to start somewhere. Some of these origin stories people and things have are pretty inspiring, whether it's from rags to riches or simply getting to a better place than where you were before. But today we're not looking at the inspiring stuff, maybe just one. But what I want you to see is the strange and unusual, as the title of this video entails. I'm going to be showing you some strange origins of things that have nothing to do with one another. And it's been a good minute since I've had an opportunity to make a video, so let's just get right into it. We're going to start off with the original data that inspired this video, which is the fact that NASCAR was practically started with moonshiners. Almost 100 years before Prohibition, there has been a group of people that were advocating for the ban of alcohol, with one of the most important and earliest groups being the temperance movement. Another major group that formed nearly 60 years later was the Anti-Saloon League. These two groups seem to have been major factors to the creation of the 18th Amendment, which prohibited the creation, transportation, and selling of alcohol. The amendment was ratified on January 18, 1919, and became active the next day. Of course, there were mixed reactions, with those who wanted the change obviously being glad for what happened, while those who still wanted their alcohol weren't. And these people were going to find a way to get their booze, even if they had to break the law, which led to bootlegging and moonshiners. So Prohibition begins, and pretty early on, many moonshiners across the country started to modify their cars. Most of them simultaneously realized that if they wanted to be able to get their liquor around without being caught, they were going to have to modify their cars. The modifications they did to their cars basically consisted of removing as much of the interior as they can, but not the driver's seat. This was so they could fit as much liquor as they can, and to support this weight, the spring suspensions were modified as well. The most important modification slash replacement was the engine, since they needed their cars to go fast. It was important that almost nothing was done to the exterior of the car in order to lower suspicion and blend with the other cars on the road. In a way, the speed of the car was more like a getaway option if a car chase were to occur. We've mentioned the modifications that would be done to the car, but what about the model of the car? Well, it seems like the choice for the model changed as the years went by as more cars were made. It seems that the original model being used was the car that was out at the time, the Ford Model Ts. But once the Model A was made in 1927, moonshiners were switching over to that. Of course, many models of car were being used throughout the years, but the most popular choice for moonshiners wouldn't release for another 5 years. In 1932, the Ford Model 18 came out. The significance this model had was the fact that it contained a V8 engine, which was quite powerful and what was needed to outrun the cops. But of course, the police also had access to fast cars, so now you have these two groups of incredibly fast cars playing a game of cat and mouse. But moonshiners had a much more on the line than the police, so they needed to learn to not only drive quickly on the road, but also in the wilderness since their operations were set up out there. This ended up making the moonshiners better drivers at the end of the day, and they seem to have been quite proud about that. But once your group is deemed the best group of drivers and you take pride in your skills, the only thing left to do is to see who's the best in the group, which moonshiners did and would race one another around dirt tracks. Eventually, the public started to notice and would gain interest in the races and would end up paying to watch. So it's 1934 now, and Prohibition had come to an end in most states, and people were enjoying these races. But moonshiners still continued their operations. Some of them were both on the racetrack and participating in the illegal operation in order to avoid taxes. So as time went on, those who were still bootlegging were getting arrested, which meant that there were less and less drivers on the track. This opened the opportunity to separate stock racing from moonshiners, and former mechanic William Bill France did just that, and ended up creating the National Association for Stock Car Racing, or NASCAR. But even with all this information, it can't exactly be said that Prohibition led exactly to the creation of NASCAR. There were other car enthusiasts who were driving on the racetrack who weren't creating moonshine. France himself wasn't. But there is an obvious link between the two, which NASCAR does recognize since it does seem to have a bootlegging exhibit. Now let us step out of the car and go for a small walk, as I tell you about the few uses treadmills had before we settled on cardio. Before anything, we gotta define / give an understanding of what we consider a treadmill. A treadmill needs to have a person or animal walking on something that rotates around it, and it should have a use. So, early on, the treadmill was actually the tread wheel, and was being used by the Romans in order to help lift heavy materials for construction. A group of men would basically stand in a large hamster wheel, and as they walked, a system of pulleys and strings would operate to lift up heavy objects. This was essentially an early version of the crane. Farmers throughout history would also use the tread wheel to make other tasks easier, such as grinding grain or irrigating water. Some boats contained tread wheels in order to keep sailing when the water was still and there was no air to push the sails. On rare occasions, people would bring horses into the boat so they could walk on a treadmill in order to power the boat. They were actually walking on treadmills that resemble the ones we see today. Actually, in the 1800s, a small version of the horse's treadmill was developed for smaller animals for domestic use. Of course, these were seen around the house and farms instead of boats. But now we've reached the portion of time where treadmills were being used for evil intentions. In 1818, the Penn treadmill was created by English engineer William Cubitt. It was originally designed as a way to make use of prisoners and rehabilitate them, even though it was basically a form of punishment. This practice was occurring because it was believed that the poor would end up going to prison purposely in order to be taken care of and to get free stuff. But with the treadmill in place, people started to rethink the possibility of going to prison. The design of the Penel treadmill was similar to the tread wheel. It's just that this time it was long so up to 20 people could fit on the contraption, and it had steps installed. The constant rotation this would generate basically had the prisoners walk an infinite staircase. Prisoners would walk about 3 hours, multiple times a day, so they ended up climbing for about 10 hours a day. The treadmill started to be installed in prisons. By 1842, a bit over half of all the prisons in England, Wales, and Scotland had treadmills in them. As I stated earlier, the treadmill was originally designed to make use of the prisoners, since the rotations created a power source for grinding grain or pumping water, and later on, some of the treadmills were being used to produce electricity. It wouldn't be long until treadmills were being used for just punishment. It's said that prisoners would have to climb from 6,000 to 14,000 steps daily. Just some quick Google searching lets us know that you could burn up to 500 calories from walking upstairs for an hour. And with the 10-hour days, it's pretty obvious that the prisoners were burning much more than they were consuming, especially with the prison diet they probably had at the time. It wouldn't be until 1902 where the treadmill would be abolished from all the prisons and no longer be used for a form of torture. Quick fun fact, the Penel treadmill was actually imported to America in 1822 and was used for a bit but would eventually be abandoned by 1927 because of prison relocations. Treadmills would disappear for a bit after they were abolished, but nearly a decade later in 1911, an idea of a design surfaced. Clyde Lorraine Hagen had created a U.S. patent for a treadmill that he had dubbed Training Machine. The design was quite advanced for the time and looked similar to the modern day treadmill. It's just that this one was designed to be elevated off the floor by using 4 legs that would change in length to change the incline. It would actually be foldable for easy transportation. The patent actually ended up being granted 2 years later in 1913, but nothing seemed to advance past that. And there doesn't seem to be any significant advances with the treadmill for the first half of the 1900s. It wouldn't be until 1952 when cardiologist Robert Bruce and biomedical engineer Wayne Quinton would create the first motorized treadmill in order to get more accurate data during cardiac stress testing. It seemed to have had some similarities to the training machines since it did have the ability to adjust the incline, but this current design had the ability to adjust the speed because it was motorized. The treadmill wouldn't be designed with fitness in mind up until the late 1960s when American engineer William Staub created the treadmill he dubbed Pacemaster 600. His inspiration came from the book Aerobics by Dr. Kenneth Cooper, which seemed to have been a fitness plan. Staub actually sent Cooper the prototype for the Pacemaster 600 in order to get it approved. And the rest is history. Treadmills started to appear more in homes and gyms and ended up becoming one of the most common and successful pieces of workout equipment. So, as the floor rotates beneath your feet and you work a sweat, let me tell you how the rotating chain of a chainsaw kind of had an origins tied to childbirth. Throughout all of time, childbirth was something that obviously happened, and it's always been a painful and time-consuming process, but sometimes things may go bad, and the baby wouldn't come out correctly, which would put both the mother and baby at risk. Today, obstetricians and medicine has improved and are prepared for any possible bumps in the road, but in the past, things were risky. Nowadays, a C-section may be performed, but in the past, it most likely meant death. Anesthesia wasn't around, and hygiene wasn't prioritized, so cutting open a mother was a big risk, and most of the time was a last resort because it prioritized the baby's life over the mother's. So C-sections were risky, and babies needed to come out, which meant another procedure must have been used, and that procedure was the symphysiotomy. This procedure is almost never done today, which is why the name may sound unfamiliar. A symphysiotomy would have the surgeon divide the pubic symphysis, which is a cartilage joint that connects the two halves of the pubic bone together. Cutting this allowed a wider opening for the baby to pass through. Originally, this procedure was done using a knife and a small saw, but it was quite a time-consuming process. So in 1780, 2 surgeons, John Atkin and James Jeffrey, came up with a solution. This was obviously the chainsaw. But it wasn't the one we know today, that was just its name. The tool they made was a serrated chain with 2 handles that would be used in a sawing motion. It was dubbed Atkin's Flexible Chainsaw. It wasn't being used for just symphysiotomies, but it came in handy for cutting bone when amputations needed to be done. And this chainsaw was popular up until 1830 when a new tool was created by Bernard Hayne, which was the osteotome. This is what's commonly seen when you Google original chainsaw. It was the size of a kitchen knife and had a chain that would rotate through the use of a hand crank. This tool was not being used for symphysiotomies. Its use was for cutting through bone. It seems to be a misconception that this was being used to aid in childbirth. Heinz osteotome seemed to have been his Excalibur because nobody else seemed to have been able to use it as well as he could. Symphysiotomies and the use of a, quote, chainsaws seem to have mostly disappeared, and the osteodome is upgraded and seems to look like something that belongs in a drill kit. Around the beginning of the 20th century, the C-section started to become popular and people started to think of the possibility for the chainsaw to be used for cutting wood. In 1905, a patent came from American logger J. Benz, which took inspiration from Heinz chainsaw. In 1918, Canadian James Shad also created a patent, but his was considered the first portable one. In 1926, German mechanic Andre Still will create a patent for the first electric chainsaw and will end up creating a gas-powered one 3 years later. It wouldn't be until 1950 when the first one-man chainsaw was created, but it was still quite heavy, weighing nearly 4 times more than the modern ones. But after this point, the chainsaw would quickly evolve, becoming more light, safe, and compact until it ended up looking more and more like the ones we see today. Let's talk about Post Malone. His origin isn't exact, Strange is more sweet than anything, but as some of you may know, the beginning of Post Malone's music career has some ties with Team Crafted. Growing up, Post Malone's father, Richard Post, was the one who really got him into music. Mr. Post was always playing music and would introduce his son into a little bit of everything. His logic of music seems to come from his past since he was a DJ in his youth. Another one of Post's inspirations to get into music was Guitar Hero. Once he found himself playing the songs on Expert, he realized that quote, you can only exceed to a certain point, end quote, and decided that maybe it was time to play a real guitar. And for him, it was a rough transition since the skills didn't transfer over, but that was just the beginning since he would be able to pick up and play not long after. His father actually told him he would get him guitar lessons if he kept trying for 6 months, but after those 6 months, Post felt that he wouldn't need them anymore since he developed his own style. In high school, Post ended up joining a heavy metal band called Ashley's Arrival. He would eventually leave the band and move over to softer rock, and then eventually hip-hop, which will be around the time he started making his own beats in FL Studio. But he would keep this musical side of him a secret from his friends since he kept it to himself and was in a state of confusion at the beginning of high school. It wouldn't be until he got drunk for the first time with a group of friends when he would actually show them his musical skills. He would end up playing and singing the lyrics to Wicked Games while hammered, and his mini audience thought that he was good. During high school, Post would meet who he claims to have given him everything. This person was Jason Probst, also known as Minecraft Universe. The two of them will end up creating a parody music video, Why Don't You Love Me, for Post's art class. Post made the beats and wrote the lyrics, and Probst did the editing. And with their skills combined, the project got an A. Probst would be doing pretty good with YouTube after graduating from high school, and would end up moving to LA to live with a group of Minecraft YouTubers known as Team Crafted. But for Post, he would end up attending Tarrant Community College and continue to work at the job he currently had at the moment at Chicken Express. He would actually end up dropping out of college, leave his job, and move to LA to pursue his dream of becoming a musician. Of course, his good friend Probst had a spot for him to stay. So Post was now hanging around Team Crafted, living in their content house, and would appear in some of their live-action videos, vlogs, and make appearances in Probst's live streams to play guitar and sing some music. I personally like the Fly Me to the Moon cover, but as most know, Team Crafted would end up breaking up by March of 2014 for too many reasons that I'm not going to get into because this is about Post Malone. But I would mention that he seems to have started the closet grind after Sky left. It's difficult to pinpoint when what I'm about to talk about happened, but it seems to have happened after Team Crafted broke up. But Probst, Post, and other artists will end up forming a music group called Black Bird. Some of these artists, including Probst and Post, will end up moving into a house together in San Fernando. While living there, Probst would meet FK First and Rex Kudo. They will end up helping write and produce his debut single, White Iverson. Probst would end up helping his friend yet again, since he lent him his car so Post could drive to the Pacific Palisades, which is where the studio was located. It seems that White Iverson was produced pretty quickly, because the beat had already been made, so all that was needed to be done was write and record the song, which would normally take quite a while, but Post seemed to have written and recorded the song during his whole stay at the Palisades. Just 2 days after writing the song, he recorded it, and he would end up uploading it on SoundCloud the night the song was completely finished. It became an instant success. Within a month of the song's release, it had already had 1 million plays, and the people Post looked up to were starting to get into contact with him. Now that's some of the main things I wanted to talk about, which means we're going to move into some honorable mentions. The reason these three are honorable mentions is because I was either unsure on how real they were or either felt that they were just short. So the first one we'll be talking about is how lettuce was considered an aphrodisiac in ancient Egypt. It can't exactly be pinpointed on which type of lettuce was being used, but the possible 4 options seem to be standard lettuce, prickly lettuce, bitter lettuce, and romaine lettuce. The lettuce was described as tall and straight, so it could be either choice, but it seems that the 2 main candidates for it to possibly be is bitter and romaine. When you cut into lettuce, it releases a sort of milky white sap which seems to be compared to nut. Something pretty ironic and coincidental would be the effects this sap has. The sap is actually called lactucurium, but it's also called lettuce opium since it makes people sleepy and relax. But most importantly for this video, it's observed to have seductive effects from tests ran on mice. Lettuce also seems to be associated with the ancient Egyptian god of fertility and harvest, Min. It seemed to have been his favorite food, and its aphrodisiac properties supported him through the act. And with previously stated information of the lettuce growing tall and straight, and white sap coming out of it, and Min being the fertility god, it makes the link between lettuce and him pretty clear. Now there's this story between two Egyptian gods and princes, Horus and Seth. And after looking over it with what I originally wrote from my research, I'm afraid it might be too inappropriate for YouTube. And I'm afraid of getting this taken down. But to sum it up, Horus is next in line to be the king of Egypt, but Seth wants the position, so he challenges him to competition and attacks Horus. While Horus is sleeping, Seth does something to Horus's thighs and it gets on his hands and Horse's mother cuts Horse's hands off and throws it in a river and makes Horse put his nut in a pot. He then goes to Seth's garden, puts it on the lettuce, and Seth ate lettuce regularly. He eats the lettuce with a special sauce, and then he goes to Horse to see the great need. Seth reveals what he did to Horus, but Horus says he's lying and that they should summon both of their nut to see where it comes from. Seth's nut comes from the river from earlier, and Horus's nut comes from within Seth and reveals itself as a golden solar disk on his head. The main reason I made this an honorable mention because when I was first looking for things to talk about, I didn't think this would have been so informative, but after researching, it actually is. But when researching, I came across this thesis paper that re-examines Min's relationship with lettuce. The abstract seems to mention that a king offered lettuce to Min to improve agriculture and to have his bloodline and humanity continue to live on. The conclusion seems to bring up some points such as the context that lettuce was typically shown in besides being food that Min ate was actually funerary, since it, quote, served as both a food for the deceased and as a symbol of regeneration and rebirth due to its rapid growth habit and its green or bluish color, end quote. It brings up the possibility of a placebo effect, and it points out how in the Seth and Horus story, the lettuce was simply Seth's favorite food, but it was never disclosed on why, and the lettuce was used as a Trojan horse to get Seth to eat Horus's special sauce. But speaking of lettuce and sauce, let's talk about sandwiches, more specifically their quote, inventor. It's believed that the year was 1762, and Englishman was sitting at a gambling table for a total of 24 hours. This was noble minister John Montague, who was the 4th Earl of Sandwich. Due to his crippling gambling addiction, he hardly ate anything during the 24-hour period except for a piece of beef between 2 slices of bread. It's said that the reason for putting the beef between the bread was so he could not leave the gambling table, and it seemed it wouldn't make that much of a mess because it wouldn't have the greasy hands touching the cards. This way of eating seemed to gain people's attention, and it would grow in popularity as people ordered the same as sandwich. Cool origin story, right? A noble with a gambling addiction, since 99% of people quit right before winning. Well, it's sad to say that the story is most likely false, and that it's simply gossip made to make sandwiches look bad. This story has one source, which comes from a travel book by P.J. Grossley, but there is no doubt that Sandwich was responsible for giving sandwiches their name. It seems the real story is that Sandwich wasn't anywhere near a gambling table since he was the cabinet minister and was most likely extremely busy. So in order to sustain himself while working long hours at his desk, it's said that he ate sandwiches. When the possible true story is compared to the gossip, it's pretty easy to see how the story was twisted. Of course, he didn't invent sandwiches. People most likely ate them throughout all the time. But it didn't have a specific name before sandwich. It seems to have just been called bread and meat. Now let's go into our final origin. Let's talk about when the bunny ears finger gesture was called cuckold horns. Back during the medieval era, the term cuckold referred to a man whose wife had cheated on him, normally without him knowing. During that time, putting what is now the bunny ears behind someone's head seemed to indicate that they were a cuck. At the time, this was known as cuckold horns. The term seems to have been a combination of things relating to animals. Cuckold comes from the cuckoo bird, since they would lay their eggs in another bird's nest for them to raise. Since there was no protection at the time, the cheating wife would end up getting pregnant and would have children that don't belong to their husband. The horns come from deer since they would fight for mates. Obviously, the one who won would end up getting the lady deer, while the loser wouldn't. Pretty obvious connection there. Fun fact, it seems that sometimes men will be forced to wear some antlers in order to shame them for being a cuck. And that's it for this video. I'd like to thank you if you made it this far because I have no idea how long it's going to be. But I hope you enjoyed learning about some strange origins because this video has been in the back burner for a good minute now since I haven't had much time to do this. But all in all, if you like this video, make sure you like and subscribe for more inconsistent topics and upload dates. And that's about it. Okay, bye now.